Good evening, everybody. As I said before I finished making content on YouTube officially, that I would possibly briefly return to finish a project that I had not finished. And I've been sort of working on that as a hobby. And it's coming along. And this is more or less just a channel update because as I did decide to return one day and finish that project, I also thought possibly, as I said in a community posting, about doing a sort of study group, if you will, on the materials on this channel. And there's some other things I wanted to discuss as well, some very important things. Hey, Aaron, good to see you. Some very important things. Hey, Bang Bang Screw Tube. And it relates to the whole situation going on around the world as I put in some of my community postings, basically. I wanted to go over some of what's going on and basically throw in my 2 cents because I think it's worth discussing. So, now that everybody got to see me again, I'm gonna cover the camera back up because, yes, Susan, I'm only coming back for a brief time, like I promised I might, just for a brief time to work on a unfinished project. But I'm also gonna do like a sort of channel update, and I may, in fact, have to do, if I do a study group on this channel, I may in fact actually have to do it as a live stream so I can see everybody's feedback as it relates to that. So for a very brief amount of time, I'll return to do certain things in order to help others as far as like their overall readiness and preparedness for the future is concerned. But let me go ahead and cover this camera because it'll distract me otherwise. So, I'm going to discuss what I made as a community post as it relates to the whole Middle East situation we see going on. And hey, Rachel, yes, I'm briefly returning like I promised I might when I was stopping content creation, but I said I would briefly return to work on an unfinished project to actually add to my 96-hour invasion. It was the Texas map that I never finished, and I am gonna, I've decided I will do that. And this is sort of just a channel update and a brief return, to mention that and also talk about maybe even doing a study group of sorts with all of this, with all the material that's on this channel, this entire virtual library of material that is on this channel. It's worth reviewing for people because there's a lot that people can still apply from all of that. And that material is literally timeless. It doesn't matter how old it gets. It's going to be applicable well into the future until those events occur, because they will absolutely occur one day. It's not just prophetic, but it's also the way the reality is moving, if people haven't noticed. Now, this is not a sensationalist channel. This is not a channel that promotes, false narratives and all these crazy kooky things that come out of the MSM that infiltrates the alternative media sphere. And, I'm not a prophet of any kind. I'm not a watchman. I'm none of those things. All I am is a researcher who does extremely in-depth research into my domain of expertise, if you will, and I can say that because I've poured years worth of time into this. It started as a sort of hobby, in my teenage years, and it lasted well into adulthood, and I'm still very fascinated by, the international military domain. And, of course, I made my entire career around, being in the Army, and I got to experience a conflict as a result and see what that's really like. And I took all the knowledge from the firsthand experience and blended it with all the piles of research, mountains of research I've done into these types of things. Now, yes, I am what I put, Susan, in my actual in my community post is what I was going to also go over, because you see, there's certain prophetic things that are occurring now. I don't think this is World War III. Absolutely not. I'm not going to go, sensationalist with it and be like, oh my God, it's World War III and nukes and blah blah blah. I'm not that type of person. I am a very conservative-minded. I don't go very liberal with my analysis, in the sense that I see the worst of things and everything. Now, when I talked about us getting invaded, now that's an obvious thing, and I had to cover it, and everything is leaning that way because that's a reality of it. But in prophecy too, everything's aligning with the prophecy. And if you noticed in the book of Jeremiah, which is my favorite book in the Word, all the prophecy states that we will absolutely be invaded from all sides by enormous conventional armies. It doesn't say that Babylon's going to, be destroyed by nukes or anything. No, it says we get invaded by massive conventional armies. Yes, do I believe that, some nukes might be used? Well, of course I do. I've even had horrifying dreams about it, and I've posted some of those in their own playlist. Those are some of the first things I posted when I intended for this to just be a couple video channel, and then it turned into more. But I've had dreams of it, but even in my dreams, not everything was blanketed by nukes. There was only key places that were struck by those. It wasn't like an everywhere, like we didn't get blanketed. There was no all-out nuclear war. Now, do I believe that we'll see some of that in our lifetime as far as nukes, period, just limited use? Well, yeah, of course. But I'm not, but full-scale nuclear war? No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's not biblical. It's not correct. Yes, sure, there will be some, but it's not going to be like a full-scale nuclear conflict. And I don't even think what's going on in the Middle East is going to become the Third World War. I think it's just going to be another regional war, and I'm going to explain why. I basically, looking at everything that's going on, I see a lot of things that can contribute to Bible prophecy, potentially, if things go that way. Like I illustrated in my community post I made, over a week ago, where I said that, yes, Iran, if we get baited into some kind of confrontation with Iran, it will end very badly for us. Now, I'm going to explain why. Yeah, Rachel, there will be those types of things, but I don't see it as being like a full-scale nuke conflict or even full-scale, chemical but sure, yeah, there will be instances where those types of things get used. Absolutely. I'm not saying they won't. I'm just saying that, it's not going to be something where it's like ubiquitous and everybody's affected by it. That's just not going to be the case. Now, let me see. Okay. Now, looking at the situation, what could very well occur, like I put in my community post, and this is the most logical, rationally minded explanation, and I'm going to explain why, like I just said a minute ago. Now, what you see going on in that small country there in the Mid-E that borders Egypt and Syria, you see a situation whereby you have this very small country overall in terms of its population, in terms of its landmass. We're talking about a nation that's only like the size of comparable to an American state, like maybe Illinois or somewhere in that area, as insofar as population. So when they do a military mobilization, it's actually very true that is something that they cannot sustain very long term, because it will affect their economy. All those people being pulled out of their workforce, hundreds of thousands at a time, people that are in critical positions within their, economic structure, just suddenly being pulled out and mobilized, that's really going to hurt their economy to do something like that for a prolonged period, because again, they don't have very many people in their country. And and their workforce as a result is relatively small. If you look at like the demographics and you break it down into youngsters and younger adults and then middle-aged people and then elderly, they really can't afford to pull hundreds of thousands of people out of their economy at one time and keep them mobilized for a prolonged period. They just don't have those capabilities or the ability to do that without severely damaging themselves as a result, economically, financially, because you have to compensate those people as they're mobilized into these reserve forces. Now, other countries don't really have that type of issue necessarily because they have a vastly larger workforce and it's not as big of a deal. Like say like Russia, Russia has half our population, but it's not as big of a deal for them to mobilize their reserves, and especially not China. That hardly would hurt them at all, for their reserve forces. And China has enormous different types of reserves. If you count their whole paramilitary, which is ginormous, and their military ready reserves, which are all the people that completed their military contracts but then go into reserve status in these sorts of like reserve group armies and reserve elements of like their strategic missile forces or their air force or navy. China is enormous. Now, looking at Iran here, if we get baited into a situation where we end up in a sort of conflict with Iran. Now, that seems to be the way this is going. And I predicted that in my community post just based off of research and, how the general position taken against Iran has evolved over time and where it appears to be going. Now, Iran has a lot of power and capabilities, and people don't even realize it. They can do certain things that would severely damage the West, who is already in an incredibly weakened state, by the way, from all of its military stocks and ammunition and resources and money that was dumped into that black hole in Eastern Europe that we all know as Ukraine. And that proxy conflict has severely weakened us. And as a result, and there is no way that we would have the ammunition for a general ground war against Iran, like any type of ground invasion. That's absolutely out of the question. But what could happen, what very well looks to be possible, is that because we still have sea-based and air-based munitions that are left, we could carry out limited to moderate types of strikes against them. But herein lies the problem. We do not have the industry that could sustain a large-scale war really against anybody, like Iran or especially not against Russia, and damn sure not against China, most of all. But like Iran is clicked up with them. And believe it or not, Iran has a lot of military capabilities for a Middle Eastern country. Now, sure, they might not be the most powerful Middle Eastern nation. I believe Turkey is a little bit stronger than Iran, but Iran is definitely up there in terms of their power and capabilities because they do control large amounts of proxy forces. One of them is the Hez to the Bola, and believe it or not, that group, that one proxy group sitting in Lebanon and also in Syria, because they gained a lot of valuable combat experience during the Syrian civil war, which was a multi-faction civil war, sort of like what will occur to America in biblical prophecy in Jeremiah, where various leaders, plural, have a conflict or violence, which, depending on your Bible, the translation of it is what that says, which means a multi-faction civil conflict, like I portrayed in my work when I made that documentary, that hypothetical. Now, what you see is that group in Lebanon and Syria, they have immense amounts of arms as well. They have more rocket artillery capabilities than all of the Western European NATO states combined. That's a lot. They have over 150,000 rockets. So that's a tremendous capability just for a non-state actor to actually possess. And by a non-state actor, I mean an army without a country. Even though they're an Iranian proxy, they're not an actual nation state's armed forces. They're just a proxy militia that's controlled by a state actor known as Iran. Now, even in the Strip, and you know what I mean by the Strip, yes, Rachel, it will, and I do see that happening eventually. Talking about Damascus, but that could be a little further off in the future, or it very well could occur relatively soon. And during the Syrian civil war, you already seen large amounts of Damascus become a heap of ruins during their civil war, where there was an 8-way battle actually occurring in Damascus at the time during the Syrian civil conflict. It developed from a few different factions in Damascus to 8. It metastasized over time into 8 different factions fighting over one city. And Damascus became largely a heap of ruins already, but I do see it getting even worse for them at some point in the future. Speaking of that city. Now, you see that non-state actor, that proxy of Iran, having all this capability. Back in 2006, when I was in the Army, I followed the Israeli invasion of Lebanon very closely, and I noticed that they got very bogged down in their fight against Hezbollah, and they were very bogged down in that fight, and eventually they had to withdraw out of the area because they were just too well entrenched, and they were too effective in terms of their defensive capabilities in southern Lebanon. So Israel had to withdraw eventually. So that became a situation where they were bogged down against a non-state actor, and you could very well see the same thing occurring in the Strip down there in Gaza. So what would likely happen would be they would encounter their own domestic version of Vietnam with all the tunnel systems in the Strip that even lead into Israel proper itself. And you would have in all the rubble that's being created in the Strip, you would have all of these different tunnel systems facilitating a type of Viet Cong situation. Now, if anybody understands anything about the Vietnam conflict, tunnel systems were used extensively, not just to shelter the forces themselves, because there were hospitals and schools and, arms depots under there and everything else, you barracks and all that. You would have a very similar thing occurring in Gaza, where the Viet Cong would even use their systems to ambush U.S. forces and South Vietnamese forces. And you would see very much the same thing occurring in the Strip if they were to go in there. Sure, they might, very well take the Strip itself, but they would be now bogged down and stuck in a protracted conflict where between Hamas and there's another proxy group called Islamic Jihad, and you would have these two groups combined, comprising some nearly 50,000 armed combatants. Now the domestic, Israeli active duty military is 168,000 roughly, and that's without reserves. That's just their active military. Now you would have a guerrilla army of some 50,000, up against whatever they were to send in there. Even if they sent in 200,000 troops, to occupy the area, which they would very well occupy, they would then be stuck in a quagmire of constant ambushes and heavy losses, because urban warfare is a very difficult scenario for any army to overcome, especially when guerrilla tactics are being employed, and you have up close fighting, which would negate some of the weapons superiority advantages, of the invader going into such a situation. Because, when you put main battle tanks within proximity of either very tall piles of rubble that used to be buildings or buildings that still remain. You would have people using, anti-tank weapons and Molotovs and things like that to even the odds a bit against armored vehicles, which, even when, toward the end of the Iraq War, when I was up there in Mosul where we were 3rd ACR reunited, we were hearing all kinds of things about, the use of Molotovs and other types of weapons. And, there were these parachute grenades that were made to, be thrown to where, it would fire a sort of shape charge down into an armored vehicle. Those were actually a thing for a little while that became a nuisance, very dangerous. So, there are all kinds of things that would potentially go extremely south in such a situation. Some of the hesitancy that we see occurring right now could be a result of them, realizing that they would be in for a lot more than they think they would be in such a situation, and also potentially being assaulted from the north, from Lebanon, and even in the Golan Heights, from Syrian or even other Hezbollah or even Iranian forces on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, where the border is, because Israel took the Golan Heights, back when it had its wars with the Arabs in the area. So when they fought Syria, they captured the Golan Heights, and they've been holding it ever since, as a area to give them a sort of advantage of holding high ground where they can look down into Syria and they can watch things that are going on down there. It's like a sort of fortified large observation post, if you will, of sorts. So there would be a very dangerous situation, and because we have very limited forces as far as like ground forces in the area, and logistics remaining after this gigantic fiasco in Eastern Europe, and not to mention lacking the industry and current production rates with which to replace all these arms that have been pissed away and munitions. We have a situation in the Mid-E where there just isn't the ground forces available to, really, make a difference in any kind of conflict that erupts there. But like I said, I do see an attempt to do air and naval based strikes with missiles and such. Now, like I put in my actual community post, that could actually open the way for the Babylonian collapse, because hey Mary, good to see you. And when you see, hey Tanya, when you see the situation occur to where we get sucked into some kind of conflict with Iran, where we get baited in, you have to understand this is a geopolitical chessboard, if you will. This is a sort of situation where you have these regional wars develop, where it's like a confrontation between East and West, and it's obvious at this point. If anybody can't see that, then they're blinded to it. There's different elites who rule different power blocks, and there's even non-aligned nations. Like I said, I used to think that concept was crazy sounding, but no, the more I've done research, and very in-depth research into these topics, I absolutely see it. I see it all the time, and they're competing for whose NWO it's going to be, and there can only be one winner, and that is going to be the East, who built up their nations, their forces, their industry, and everything to be able to become the 10 kings of Revelation, who are going to dominate and crush Mystery Babylon under their heel and proclaim the true NWO, which is the beast, false prophet, and the 10 kings of Revelation. So I see these BRICS nations as the true 10 kings. They like it says in Revelation, when it talks about the 10 kings, there were kings who had not as of yet received a kingdom, but now, these modern nation states, these are the kingdoms. These nation states did not exist back when, Revelation and most of the books of the Bible were written, or I should say all the books of the Bible. None of these modern nation states existed back then. You didn't have India, you didn't have Pakistan, you didn't have China. I mean, you had the Chinese Empire, but you didn't have modern red China that you have today. Russia didn't exist. None of these places existed back in ancient times, but they do now, So it makes sense when it talks about kingdoms that have not been received as of yet by these kings, because it's talking about a future time with these modern nation states. It makes all the more sense when you really look at it. So what would happen to facilitate Babylon's collapse? I keep getting off track, but here it is. We get sucked into a conflict with Iran on the geopolitical chessboard, and basically we move our ships into position in the Mediterranean and even off the coast of Iran. Iran closes the Straits of Hormuz, and as a result, there's enormous suffering in the Western economies in Europe and North America, who now, depend on those vital oil supplies to fuel their economic sectors and, just private cars, everything. The whole economies of these nations depend on imports of oil, because domestic production, even here, has been cut substantially. And to go in and, repair and, fix all these places and get them back up to standard where they can, start, producing oil again and pumping oil again, and refining oil again, it would be a tremendous cost. It would take a lot of specialists and people that are, skilled in that area. It would take a lot of money and tools and new parts manufactured. I mean, we just wouldn't have the capabilities and money to get all that working overnight. So, roughly half of our consumption is based on foreign imports. So if that's suddenly cut drastically, that's going to cause a major collapse. So with the economy, food, fuel, everything else, finance, it's going to cause a collapse. So when Iran shuts off the Straits of Hormuz, which I can see them easily doing, they have developed military doctrine for their own defense, which is based off of hit and run concepts as far as their navy's concerned. For a country of their size, they do have a decent amount of combat aircraft when you combine the IRGC aerospace forces with their actual air force. And they have decently sized ground forces as well. And another thing is that they have Chinese and Russian forces inside their country as per bilateral agreements between Iran and each of them that were done 2 years ago. They were reported on widely. Even on my channel, I reported on that about 2 years ago. So, you have a roughly 50,000 Chi-Coms, which is comparable to essentially a group army in terms of size, a Chinese group army, and you have Russian assets there as well, some Air Force, and I'm sure there's plenty of potent electronic warfare and ISR capabilities, which is your, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, your not just your radars, but your satellites, your drones, all of that type of stuff. And Russia and China would be lending Iran their indirect support if we tried to do something. So there would be plausible deniability, which would keep it as a regional conflict, because when Russia and China want to invade us, they want to do it on their terms. They don't want it to be forced to where they have to, go ahead and act on their plans before they have everything in position, if you know what I mean. So they would want it to have an air of plausible deniability, where they would lend Iran their immense capabilities for ISR and electronic warfare, which China and Russia have the best electronic warfare in the world, bar none. They've proven it before with Russia shutting off the USS Donald Cook, one of our most advanced ships, an Aegis class destroyer, and then you had the same thing happen with aircraft in the Pacific Ocean, where they strayed within range of the electronic warfare assets on Mumian Island, which caused them to almost lose control and crash their aircraft. This was some type of directed electromagnetic weaponry. So, in within their electronic warfare capabilities overall. So, this for them to be able to shut off a ship and nearly do so with aircraft that strayed just within range, that says a lot about the capabilities themselves in that electronic warfare domain. So, I have no doubt that such things are within Iran, in position to help defend Iran if it were to ever be attacked, by anybody, as well as the ISR capabilities. China has the most military satellites right now of any nation on Earth. Although we have the most commercial, China has the most military, and Russia has the third most military satellites after us. But they still have enough to where they're extremely dangerous and capable. They have enough to get the job done. Let's just put it that way. And Russia also has very powerful electronic warfare, and just forces in general, as they've shown by grinding down Western capabilities in Ukraine over time, and the Ukrainians themselves. And that was only using roughly 5% of all of their military capabilities, because in the meantime, while they used their very small limited incursion forces of some 70 combat battalions, along with the local militias of the LPR and DPR and their support forces backing them up. I mean, that's not very many troops. We're talking between 63 and 65,000 Russian forces themselves when you look at the size of their battalions and Russian sizes of battalions, average sizes, and then of course you had the LPR and DPR proxy forces fighting along with them. And in the meantime, while all of this has been going on, as you know, and as I've covered many times, Russia has been building up hundreds of thousands of troops in a crescent shape around that country in Eastern Europe. So you have in Belarus and in parts of Russia and even in parts of their newly taken territories, just to the northwest of Mariupol, you have these enormous forces building up that haven't even been committed yet. Full complement of armor, artillery, aircraft, everything you can imagine. So missiles, all of it. So going back to Iran, if they close off the Straits of Hormuz and it damages our economies, you can imagine that, we would do everything in our power to try and break any type of blockade. But here's where it becomes problematic, because we don't have the ground forces to do a ground invasion of Iran, which is actually a really good thing, because if we did do a ground invasion, Russia and China would jump in and help Iran, which would then, yes, it would be a conflict drawing in major superpowers, and it would crush us. But fortunately, we can only do really, air and naval strikes. And Iran, speaking of them, has over 2,000 tanks as of this year, because they introduced their new Karar and Zulfikar tanks to everything they've already had, which initially, there's a lot of old numbers listed, but with their new numbers that have been produced and their batches coming in from... See, Iran is now completely self-sufficient in most areas of military capabilities as far as like manufacturing is concerned. Iran can produce their own tanks, their own small arms, their own aircraft, their own missiles. So Iran has over 2,000 tanks as of this year. They have over 2,345 different armored fighting vehicles as far as like APCs and IFVs, but they have a lot of trucks as well. Rocket artillery, they have 1,900 rocket artillery projectors, which are their pieces. They have roughly 620 field artillery howitzers of different types. That's towed and self-propelled. And air defense artillery, they have 2,424 different missile systems and roughly 500 cannon-based systems, which are like your flak type guns, like your 57 millimeter and those sorts of cannons. And Helicopters, they have roughly 500. They have over 10,000 cruise and ballistic missiles. That's a pretty sizable force as far as missile systems go. And their air defense systems actually are quite decent. They have the new Bavar 373, which has their longest range air defense missiles, the Syed 4 missiles launched from that platform, which have a range of about 187 miles. Now, they have some very potent anti-ship missiles as well, like the Abu Mahdi, which is an anti-ship missile with a range of roughly 622 miles, and it carries a 900-pound HE warhead. And, of course, there's the Ra'ad anti-ship system that they had even before that, which is, still fairly formidable. It has a range of about 218 miles, and it carries a 1,212-pound HE warhead, and it's a sea-skimming missile. It can be fired from ship-based platforms or land-based platforms, like from trucks, like the Abu Mahdi, and that can also be air-launched too. So you have their active military is about 420,000 active troops between their active duty army of 350,000, their air force of 37,000, 18,000 personnel navy, and roughly 15,000 air defense forces, which is separate from their army and air force. You have an additional 270,000 paramilitary, which is their IRGC, and in addition, they have what's called their besiege forces, and besiege is their popular mobilization forces, which is basically like another paramilitary. It's like a home defense type of militia. There's 600,000 of them that can be called up immediately, and then they have millions more men that are signed up for it, but they're not on any type of prepared mobilization status. So in other words, if Iran got invaded, they would call up, these millions of other men, but they just, as it stands right now, there's 600,000 of them that are available for immediate call up, like in a crisis. So their navy, it's not anywhere near the biggest in the world, but with its capabilities as far as its hit and run type of capabilities, and they also have the IRGC Navy, and there's an IRGC Air Wing, like their aerospace forces, which have 50 combat aircraft in addition to the 400 that the Iranian Air Force has. So in total, they have about 450 when you combine the aerospace IRGC with the regular Air Force, and their Navy has thousands of speedboats, which they have about between 3,000 and 5,000 speedboats in the IRGC Navy, and they have 126 fast attack vessels. And that's just the IRGC Navy. And their regular Navy, there's 31 amphibious vehicles like hovercrafts, and there's 24 submarines. Most of the subs are what is called miniature subs, but they're still subs nonetheless that have capability to launch cruise missiles and some ballistic missiles on their larger subs. The frigates, they have 7 frigates, 3 corvettes, 19 fast attack. This is their Navy, the regular Navy, and 46 littoral patrol boats. So Iran, as you can see, depends on a lot of very small vessels, but they're ideal for coastal defense, like littoral defense. They can defend their coastline and blockade a small strait, which is Hormuz. Hormuz is a very narrow strip of sea that connects the Persian Gulf to the larger Indian Ocean. So they are more than capable of blocking off the Straits of Hormuz, with what they have. And with their land and other, like their ship-based anti-ship missiles, they have an incredible range to them, because 622 miles for the Abu Mahdi, that would force our naval vessels to have to sit very far off the Iranian coast, which would shorten the range. Like if you had carrier-based aircraft, it would shorten the effectiveness of those aircraft because they would have to fly at a much longer range and wouldn't be able to carry out a combat mission for a very long amount of time at all. And that's using extra fuel tanks and everything. So, if you sail within a certain range of their coast with a carrier group, you're going to lose some ships. They have that capability. That just like Russia, just like China, they have the capability to sink our ships. Now, if you combine incredible Chinese and Russian ISR strike capabilities to the Iranian military, that would really up their danger level as far as dealing with them, because the Chinese and Russians obviously have even better stuff than the Iranians have, and the Iranians are pretty decent on their own, but like you combine Chinese and Russian ISR capabilities, that would make the Iranian weapons far more effective than even they already are by themselves. And same thing with electronic warfare, degrading the atmosphere around Iran, making it exceedingly difficult for ships and also enemy aircraft to operate over the Iranian skies and ships near the coast. So, if you combine, their allied capabilities to Iran, even if it's just indirect capabilities where they could have plausible deniability, Iran becomes an extremely dangerous foe to attack. So that was the point of my community post, was to illustrate that you have a very, very dangerous situation. Now, back in Vietnam, we lost immense amounts of aircraft to North Vietnam, and North Vietnam received a lot of military assistance from both the Soviet Union and from China in terms of air defense capabilities and aircraft and ground-based weapons, everything. And North Vietnam downed thousands of our Air Force aircraft and helicopters, along with it. But mostly, I'm talking about like fighter jets, ground attack, aircraft, heavy bombers were lost, like B-52s, and I'm talking about to like early air defense weapons that existed back then. There's far better ones now. So like if we were to go up against, Iran, you can expect America to have losses very close to what we suffered against North Vietnam in the Vietnam War. You could expect us to lose a lot of aircraft and some ships as well. We would have to sail away with a bloody nose and be forced to concede to some kind of ceasefire agreement or peace treaty or whatever. It would be a defeat for us, sort of like the Vietnam War. But this would really hurt us in conjunction with Russia doing their master stroke in Ukraine, where they launch these hundreds of thousands of forces they've built up against Ukraine to finish them off once and for all, after they've ground them down for nearly 2 years. I can very easily see that happening. That would damage our prestige. Like it would, our prestige is already pretty bad around the world, but such a thing would damage our reputation immensely. It would be a morale, a sinking event. It would sink the ship of, American morale to see us, be defeated in the Middle East, have the Straits of Hormuz closed to oil and damage our economy, as well as having Russia finish Ukraine off. All of that happening at one time after all the resources, money, ammunition, logistics, everything we poured into Ukraine, and then us, losing forces directly in the Middle East. If you combine all of that, can you even imagine what type of mayhem that would cause? That is what I'm saying would lead into prophecy being fulfilled as far as it relates to basically as it relates to basically what happens here in prophecy with our economy crashing, followed by an internal conflict, and basically, the foreign invasion that would come after that. Everybody in the chat, please be respectful. This isn't a place for arguing and fighting and all of that and everything. Everybody, even if you have an issue with each other, everybody be cool. This isn't the place for that. Everybody chill out, man. I'm trying to do something very serious here. This is basically, me trying to put all this stuff into a more rational perspective compared to like some of the stuff that other people have been putting out about this situation. I mean, it's not quite World War III. It's not there yet. And, what I'm trying to say is, I'm being very conservative as far as like the way I perceive all this and why and all the evidence. And this may very well not even become a full-blown regional conflict. It's basically, no fighting in here. I don't need anybody, trying to argue with each other. Nobody's going to ruin my chat. If anybody is ruining my chat, kick them out. I'm not going to tolerate that. Yeah, this is basically, Snaps, knock it off, dude. This isn't the place for that. Everybody needs to chill out. If you're going to argue here, if anybody's going to argue here, do it somewhere else, because this ain't the place for that. I don't tolerate disrespect here of any kind, and I expect everybody to be adults, because this is a very serious topic that I'm covering, and I don't have time for arguments or any pettiness from anybody. That goes for everybody. Everybody chill out here. So what I'm saying is that I see this potentially fulfilling prophecy if it goes to that level where we have basically us getting into a regional conflict with Iran. Now, it may not even go that far. And I've conceded as much, because I've even said in my community post that it might even stay a situation that is something that doesn't leave the borders of Israel. So you might have a situation where no other nations get pulled into it, and it could stay a very small scale, very localized thing. If diplomacy happens to work out between, larger nation states and convincing both sides to stop, their aggression against one another. So you might have a situation where diplomacy might save the day at the last minute, or you very well might have a situation like I laid out as far as it relates to us getting embroiled into some kind of limited conflict against Iran and having to sail away in defeat because they sunk ships and they shot down aircraft, and sailors and pilots came home in body bags, which, obviously I don't want, and nobody should want that. But that's exactly what would happen if we get into a conflict with Iran, along with the Straits of Hormuz being closed and all the trouble that would come of that, which would make prophecy come to pass about Mystery Babylon's collapse and famine in Jeremiah, along with the civil conflict, the multi-way Syrian-style civil conflict that would come right after that, and then the enormous foreign invasion that comes right after that. So that's what I'm basically explaining, like I explained with my community post and in this video, is that's exactly what I see happening. Now, like I said, I realize that we live in a time where, you could see a few nukes, happening here and there, but I just don't see that right now. And I don't see it getting anywhere near the scale of a full-scale nuclear conflict. That's hysteria. That's false narratives. That's all, mainstream media narrative stuff that gets pushed down to these large channels that are, often, called pogo channels, which spread these types of narratives and false news and everything else that isn't real, and they tend to just come up with a lot of this stuff on their own even as well. I mean, I've seen it a whole bunch of times, and you have to be really, really cautious with the types of things you watch and the types of because remember, in a time of any kind of hostilities or conflict, truth is one of the first casualties, and you're not always going to get the correct information, and you have to really learn how to take narratives apart. I've shown people how to do it on this channel. I still have a lot of really good community posts like that are still even up. And basically, I just basically want it to be understood that you have these situations, and like we saw with Ukraine for the longest time, the truth didn't start coming out until the very end of that conflict, and now even Western media can't even hide the fact that Russia's, dominating in that conflict and crushing Ukraine with very small forces, by the way. You have people say some crazy things like, oh, they weren't able to capture Kiev. Well, they weren't trying to capture Kiev. Kiev is a city of over 2 million people, and when you send the 104th Air Assault Regiment, which is, about, 2,500 people, and you send a battalion of Spetsnaz to capture, airports and air bases in the area, in the vicinity, that's not quite a large enough force to capture Kiev. They had a mission there that's called a feint attack or a diversionary attack. And I'm also sure that they did that to try to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table, because at first that was the whole objective of Russia. They wanted Ukraine to stop attacking ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, and they wanted Ukraine to obey the Minsk Accords, which they agreed to, and they violated those, and they were about to go into eastern Ukraine and crush the ethnic Russian proxy forces of Russia that were there. Now, I'm not pro-Russian. I'm just stating facts. These are facts. This is what happened, and that's how that whole horrific conflict developed. And now you have hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians. Between the Russian army and the Russian proxy militias, you have about 25,000 dead. There's many more wounded, of course, on both sides, but hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians. So we're talking about a conflict that, it was basically, it became a situation where where the West pumped in all of this aid in terms of money, resources, and weapons and ammunition, only to have the vast majority of it destroyed, and for Ukraine to be demographically ruined as millions of people left the country and many people were annihilated in that conflict, as well as, wounded. And you have a situation basically where Ukraine is demographically destroyed. It'll never be a real nation state, a viable nation state ever again. And that's even if Russia allows the rump Ukraine to continue on existing as some kind of puppet state. It'll never, ever be a viable nation state again. It's been destroyed. Most of the people that fled have already said that they would never return. I mean, it's ruined. I mean, the best thing for them would be if, after the conflict ends, if Russia just reabsorbed all that into their country, because aside from that, it'll be a ruined nation state that'll never be viable again. Otherwise, it would have to be rebuilt. And, the West wants to use, BlackRock to rebuild it, and China wants to rebuild it as far as like the East is concerned. They have their own plans to rebuild Ukraine after the conflict. So, you have these competing interests around the world, and now you have it in the Middle East. And I'm sure there's going to be more regional wars. In fact, I made a video a long time ago when I was still doing short videos about these regional conflicts as a means of not just distraction, but as a means to get us tied down, and that's already happened in Europe, and now it's happening here too. And it's just going to weaken us severely, and it's going to set us up for what's coming when we collapse, have a multi-way civil conflict, and then we're invaded. That's going to set up for all of that. So that's the situation that, as I see it, and basically explained everything based on all the research I've done. All the capabilities of Iran and their allies that are inside their country, would play a huge role in us having massive losses. So I'm going to see what people are saying before I go into my next thing, which is going to be basically about, some kind of study group for this material on this channel. And basically, oh, hey, Tommy, what's up, man? Good to see you. Yeah, I basically wanted to discuss that and the importance of it, because it is important, because if it does get to that point, it cause that prophecy to happen as far as our economy collapsing and famine. I'm saying a big collapse, like the once and for all, large collapse that leads into the civil conflict that's in prophecy in Jeremiah, which followed by the foreign invasion. And all the reality does seem to be lining up for it to happen, relatively quickly, at least the collapse, so that could very well be the cause of it. And or diplomacy might prevail at the last minute and prevent that from happening, or at least postpone it from happening. I should say postpone it from happening. But either way, this is a very bad situation we're walking into, no matter how you look at it. And all the provocations, sending carrier groups and, a small group of Marines, like, 2,000 Marines, that's not a lot of, forces. I mean, even to bolster, inside of Israel, to like bolster their forces, that's really not a lot of combat capability. I mean, the ships are one thing and the aircraft, but I'm saying like ground forces wise, we really don't have a lot of, capable ground forces left in the Mid-East. I mean, we have a small enclave of forces that are still holding on in Syria that are increasingly hard to resupply. I mean, you have forces in Saudi, but because of Saudi joining up with BRICS, I don't see the Saudi king lifting a finger to help us if something goes wrong. I don't see them lifting a finger. I mean, they would probably make it very difficult to operate outside of their nation as far as our bases there are concerned. If we were in some type of like hostile action against Iran, I'm sure the Saudi king would make it very difficult for our forces in his country to operate out of his country. And Turkey's done that before. Turkey has absolutely done that before. Turkey refused to, be a part of the Iraq invasion as far as, letting large amounts of our forces, operate outside of their country. So, that could complicate things very much. And, it's not just that, it's many other factors, like all the pro-Iranian forces that exist in Iraq and, elsewhere in the Mideast and, in Yemen. I mean, there's Iranian proxy forces all over that subcontinent of Asia. It's a subcontinent. It's part of Asia, but it's a subcontinent. The Middle East, sort of like South Asia, where you have, India and Pakistan and Bhutan and, Bangladesh and Nepal. That's a subcontinent. And then, of course, you have East Asia. I mean, Asia is a very large continent, and that's very dangerous that we have very strong opponents in that part of the world that could face us down. Because remember, even that proxy group in Lebanon, Hezbollah, has a lot of combat experience after the Syrian civil war, and they have a lot of rocket artillery at their disposal. Of course, anti-tank weapons and some air defense, but they have a lot of rocket artillery, and that would be very devastating if they used it. So then you have the other groups that are in Gaza, and elsewhere. So you have potentially a very, very dangerous situation unfolding for all the reasons I've given, not just in my community post, but that I've gone over here. As you know, China has some of the best military technology on earth, and even Russia does as well. And they would be backing Iran to the hilt. China's got incredible air-to-air missile systems, like, they have the PL-12 and the even longer-range PL-15, which is, as of right now, as it stands, that is the longest-range air-to-air missile, fired from a fighter jet that there is. It has a 190-mile range, and the export version has a 90-mile range, but 190 miles, that's almost twice what our Phoenix missile has, which, is our longest-range air-to-air missile. While we're trying to develop develop new ones to compete, but that for a while was our longest range missile at 90 miles. And that's just the export version of the PL-15 has a 90-mile range. Now the Chinese, the domestic version is 190 miles. The PL-12, which is quite common in their inventory, has a 62-mile range for their domestic variant, and then their export version is a 43-mile range. And then you have basically China developing a new missile, air-to-air missile system, the PL-17, which has a 250-mile range. So AWACS, that are there, and tankers to support any type of aggression, like airstrikes, like combat aircraft missions, like I'm talking about ours, like our AWACS and our tanker aircraft that would be there to support any kind of fairly long-range, combat operations. Those missiles, even the PL-15 is basically made to nullify those types of things because of the incredible range. I mean, that gives you an incredible over-the-horizon standoff capability, the PL-15. That definitely is a danger to AWACS and tankers. And of course, Russia has some very good missiles in its inventory as well, like the R-77 air-to-air missile. And, the radar systems that China and Russia have, can easily detect stealth aircraft, like China's SLC-7 L-band 3D surveillance radar. And then the smaller version, which is highly portable, is the YLC-8E, which you can put almost anywhere. I mean, China and Russia would be lending their capabilities to Iran. So that's what would make it extremely dangerous, whether that's not just their ISR strike capabilities integrated into Iranian weapons, or their electronic warfare capabilities, which are very potent and dangerous. That's also lending technology to Iran to build better weapons, which, has been going on to some extent, because Iran has built some new tanks and, new models of tanks, and they've built new models of missiles. And I'm sure a lot of that has to do with Chinese and Russian assistance in those areas. So basically, this situation is really a huge deal if it becomes a situation where we go against Iran. So you have it where, that is a very real danger, very real problem. But, you could have a situation too where, again, this all could be resolved by diplomacy, which, I'm really not sure yet. We'll have to see where things fall, because you have the BRICS nations trying to do diplomatic, channels to see if they can, somehow, some way get the two sides to not expand this conflict. But we'll see how that goes, because I see Babylon trying to expand things and get into a conflict with Iran by any means possible, because we've had it out for Iran for a long time, but it's not going to end well if it goes there. So going to my other subject now that I've gone over that, I'm basically going to potentially do a study group, but the only way I could figure out how to do that over my material would be to basically do a type of situation where I do it as a live stream. So basically, that's what I'm thinking about doing, and I'm also thinking about returning to do my project. Yeah, I'm sorry. I had people trying to call me while I'm doing this. I don't know what's going on, but people are being real immature, and, people need to knock off all the fighting. Not at my channel. That's not the place for it. So yeah, don't text or call about any kind of, arguments you're having with other people. That's not my business, not my problem. So this is my channel. Anyways, I'm thinking about coming back to do my project, my last project, as well. So that was an update for that as well. So I'm going to do my last maps for, the Texas map that was unfinished. And, this was just made to be an update to let people know about those things, as well as, what I see going on in the Mid-E and also somewhat in Europe as well. So if anybody wants to say anything, I will go over the chat now. Yeah, I don't know what's going on, everybody. I don't know why everybody's fighting on my channel. This isn't the place for it. I meant for this to be a very normal stream, and I'm not involved in whatever pettiness is going on, and I don't understand, and I'm not involved in none of that. So if people are respectful, don't kick them out. But if they're fighting, that's a whole different thing. This isn't the place for it. I don't understand what people's issues are. But everybody, I appreciate everybody coming, everybody, and thank you for coming. So I'm gonna get off here now. But yeah, I'm glad I could come back briefly and let everybody know.